Two men walk together on a dusty road in the Roman province of Asia, somewhere in the Lycus Valley, and one of them carries a sealed scroll, pressed flat against his chest, hidden beneath the folds of his cloak. He has walked roads before, but never carrying anything like this. You can picture the heat rising off the stones, the smell of dust and pack animals and distant cook fires. Mountains on either side turn purple at dusk. Behind them, weeks of travel from the coast. Ahead, past the next ridge, a small city called Colossae, a city famous. If it is famous for anything at all, for the deep crimson wool its dye shops produce and ship out across the empire. A city most people in the Roman world have never heard of, and never will. One of the travelers is named Tychicus, entrusted with the official errand. The other, walking quietly beside him, carries something far heavier than parchment. Neither man knows every line written inside that scroll. They know it came from a prison cell hundreds of miles away. They know the writer's name is Paul. And the quieter of the two men knows that somewhere in those pages, his own name is written. His name is written there, though not for you just yet. Stay with me, because this is not a story about an ordinary letter. Or rather, it is, but it is definitely not the kind of letter you are picturing in your mind right now. You are about to find out what happens when a tiny house church, in a forgettable Roman backwater, starts drifting away from Jesus. Not toward atheism, not toward rebellion, toward something far more dangerous because it looks holy. They focused on angels, rules, and secret wisdom. This created a spirituality so layered with extra requirements that Jesus quietly became optional. He became a nice addition to their lives, but he was no longer the absolute center. From a chained wrist in a dark Roman prison, an apostle who has never even visited this city writes the most cosmic description of Jesus Christ, found anywhere in the entire New Testament, to stop this dangerous drift. This is not a letter about angels, rituals, or secret spiritual hierarchies. Instead, this is a profound letter about who Jesus actually is, what he holds together, and what his supreme authority means for all of us today. It speaks directly to anyone who has ever felt like their faith was almost enough, but not quite. We will get back to the man on the road and what he is really carrying. But we are not ready to reveal that just yet. First, you must understand how a church gets pulled away from Christ without anyone ever noticing they left. His name is Epaphras, and before this he was just a regular face in a small house church congregation in Colossae. You should know something about this city first. Centuries before Epaphras was born, a Greek king named Antiochus moved thousands of Jewish families out of Babylon. He resettled them across this exact valley where Colossae sits. The historian Josephus records this resettlement plainly, almost as a side note, but it explains everything. By the time the gospel reaches Colossae, Jewish food laws, Sabbath customs, and angel traditions are already deeply rooted. These ancient traditions had been simmering together with Greek philosophy for generations. It was highly fertile soil for new ideas, but unfortunately, not all of it was fertile for the right thing as the church began to grow. There is one more fact worth knowing about this valley, and you will want to remember it. The Roman historian Tacitus records that this entire region was struck by a massive earthquake sometime in the early 60s of the 1st century. This devastating event happened during the very years. Most scholars believe this letter was written. The ground itself, under the houses where these believers gathered to argue about angels and festivals, would simply not hold. We will come back to that fact, because Paul is about to make a claim that no earthquake can touch. And the philosophy circulating through Colossae at this time was not crude superstition either. Greek thinkers had spent generations debating how a perfect, unreachable God could touch a messy, physical world without being contaminated. The popular answer was a complex chain of lesser spiritual beings standing in between. These intermediaries supposedly handled the dirty work of contact with matter, so the highest God never had to get his hands dirty. It sounded very sophisticated, like the kind of advanced faith that educated people held back then. This teaching left Jesus looking like only one helpful rung on a much longer spiritual ladder. Eventually, Epaphras becomes a believer and starts a house church there, but at some point he realizes that something is terribly wrong. Here's what most people completely miss about this critical moment. Nobody in Colossae thinks they are actually leaving Jesus. That is the true danger. A teacher starts suggesting that yes, you have Christ, but you need more. They claimed you must also honor the proper spiritual powers governing the calendar, the elements, and the unseen hierarchy between you and God. Another voice adds that certain foods and special festivals bring you closer to holiness. Someone mentions dramatic visions and the worship of angels, creating a secret tier of spirituality only the truly devoted ever reach. Each new edition, taken on its own, sounds perfectly reasonable and sincere even. Nobody stands up in that house church and announces they are rejecting Christ. They simply keep adding one careful brick at a time until Christ is still technically in the building, just no longer holding up the roof. You can imagine how it feels from the inside. It does not feel like betrayal, but like growth, and finally getting serious about your faith. Epaphras watches people he loves add layer after layer onto a complete gospel. This gospel was supposed to be finished, sufficient, and entirely whole on its own. Instead, he watches the center of the room slowly shift away from a crucified and risen Christ toward an ever-expanding list of requirements. Because he cannot fix this massive problem alone, he does something almost unthinkable. He leaves Colossae and travels roughly 900 miles, on foot and by ship, just to reach a man sitting alone in a Roman prison cell. A man he may have never met in person, a man named Paul. You can imagine what that journey costs him. Weeks, maybe months. Danger on the road, bandits and bad weather, and uncertain lodging in towns where he knew no one. There was no guarantee Paul would even be alive when he arrived, or that the guards would let a stranger in. He left behind a wife, children, and a livelihood on the slim hope that an imprisoned apostle could help save his church. Epaphras undertook this massive sacrifice out of love for a community he valued far more than his own comfort. But the story gets even stranger. When he finally reaches that cell, he does not find a broken, defeated man. Instead, he finds someone praying fervently for churches he has never seen. Paul was busy dictating letters to distant congregations, treating his heavy chains like a minor inconvenience to a much larger global mission. This is Paul, somewhere around the early 60s, most likely under house arrest in Rome, as described at the end of the book of Acts. There is a guard stationed at the door and a heavy chain fastened tightly around his wrist. He has no income, no platform, and no pulpit. He has only visitors, ink, and time. Picture the room itself for a moment. It is rented, cramped, and paid for by faithful friends who have chosen not to abandon him in prison. A single clay lamp burns low because daylight through one small window is never quite enough. A scribe sits nearby with a reed pen and a fresh sheet of papyrus, waiting patiently for the apostle to speak his next words. Somewhere across that cramped room, leaning quietly against the wall, is a man who has recently started showing up to listen. No one yet knows the full story of how he got there, or what his name will come to mean to history. Epaphras tells him everything: the angel worship, the food restrictions, the philosophy dressed up as spiritual depth, the slow erosion of Christ from the center of a church Epaphras loves enough to walk 900 miles over. You would expect immense grief from Paul. And there is real grief, the kind that aches for people you cannot physically reach. He writes later about how much he struggles, labors, and wrestles in prayer for these believers. He had never even met these people face to face. But watch what happens next. Instead of sinking into despair, Paul does something defiant. He picks up a pen, or rather dictates powerful words directly to his waiting scribe. Since his hands are likely restrained, he dictates a beautiful hymn instead of writing a standard list of corrections. He does not offer a dry rulebook or a point-by-point rebuttal. He writes about who Jesus actually is. Paul understands a truth that changes the entire shape of this letter. You do not fight a shrunken, limited view of Jesus by adding more rules to follow. Instead, you fight that dangerous drift with a much bigger Jesus. So from a rented room under heavy guard, with a personal debt he cannot pay and a legal verdict he cannot predict, Paul begins composing the most cosmic, exalted description of Christ found anywhere in the New Testament. He reveals a Christ who is higher than angels, older than creation, and holding the entire universe together by his sheer divine will. You are about to hear exactly what he wrote to this anxious church holding its breath. Let us pause on this pattern for a moment, because it matters far beyond one small ancient city. A church does not usually walk away from Jesus by rejecting him outright. That would be far too obvious to notice and resist. Instead, it happens one small addition at a time. A rule here, a ritual there, and a quiet whisper that maybe Christ alone is not quite enough. They claim you need something extra to truly belong and be taken seriously. If this subtle pattern feels uncomfortably familiar to you in your own century instead of the first one, good. Hold on to that thought tightly. We are absolutely going to come back to it later in this discussion. If you want to discover more of this true history, full context, and what these ancient letters actually meant to the people who first received them, this channel exists for exactly that purpose. Make sure to subscribe now. Tell me in the comments if you have ever felt like your faith needed something extra to be real. We are about to find out what Paul says to people who feel that way. Let us go straight back to that dark Roman prison cell, because what Paul writes next is about to get cosmic. Here is what Paul actually dictates, word by word, from that rented room. He starts with a single Greek phrase that would have stopped every educated Colossian in their tracks. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Pay attention to this, because the word translated firstborn is prototokos, and it does not mean what you might assume. It does not mean first created, as if Jesus were simply the oldest item on a divine assembly line. In the ancient world, firstborn was a title of rank and inheritance. Picture a wealthy household where the firstborn son does not simply arrive first chronologically. He receives the estate, he holds authority over his brothers. His name carries the family's honor into the next generation, regardless of who else was technically born before or after under that same roof through different circumstances. So when Paul calls Jesus the prototokos over all creation, he is not describing when Jesus came into existence. He is declaring that Jesus holds first claim over everything that exists. Every throne, every power, every authority, visible or invisible, here on earth or stationed in realms you cannot see. And then Paul keeps going and the claim gets larger. For by him, Paul writes, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Through him and for him. Not just that Jesus helped build the universe like some kind of cosmic contractor working from someone else's blueprint. The universe exists through him as its source and for him as its purpose. Every galaxy, every grain of sand, and every angelic power they were pressured to worship was made by Jesus and for Jesus. Think about what words like thrones, powers, rulers, and authorities meant to people under Roman rule. Caesar sat on a massive throne while local governors held absolute authority. Tax collectors, magistrates, and garrison commanders all represented intense layers of power stacked over an ordinary person's daily life. These were visible reminders of who was really in charge. Paul's radical claim reaches past every one of those earthly thrones, all the way up to whatever unseen powers the Colossians imagined standing above Caesar himself. He says the exact same thing about every single spiritual layer. They were created through him and for him. You can imagine how that single sentence would land on a believer who had started bowing toward angels for protection. Paul is not telling them that angels are evil. He is telling them that angels are merely creations. Jesus made the very beings they were starting to fear. This is where his message gets truly remarkable and powerful. Paul writes a line that pulls the rug out from under the entire false teaching system. He states clearly that Christ is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Remember that massive earthquake we mentioned, the one Tacitus records tearing through this very valley. Stone columns did not hold together that day. Roof beams did not hold together. Entire walls, built by careful Roman engineers who knew exactly what they were doing, came down anyway. And yet here is Paul, writing to people who lived inches from that kind of devastation, claiming that the one thing in the universe which never fails to hold together is a crucified carpenter from Nazareth, not the empire. It was not the grand architecture or the calendar of festivals that held firm. It was Christ. He does not just hold things together in the past tense, like a builder who walks away. He holds them together right now. He holds all things together right now as you listen. The Greek word Paul reaches for here is pleroma, which means fullness. It represents the complete sum and the entire measure of something, with absolutely nothing missing. The false teachers infiltrating Colossae used this exact word to describe a totality of divine power spread out across a complex hierarchy. They claimed you needed to climb through layers of angels to ever reach God. They pictured a spiritual ladder with no visible top, where Jesus was merely the first rung. Think of it this way. Imagine a cup of water filled only halfway, and someone telling you that you need more to reach the top, that you need a dozen other cups, each one a different ritual or spirit or rule, to ever reach the top of the glass. That is the picture the false teachers were selling. Christ plus angels, Christ plus festivals, Christ plus secret knowledge. In their view, Christ by himself was insufficient. But Paul takes that word right out of their hands. He writes that God was pleased to have all his divine fullness dwell in Christ, rather than being spread across a ladder. Divine power was not divided into ranks and territories. The entire fullness of God was contained in one physical body, walking on one set of human feet, and hanging eventually from a rugged Roman cross for our sake. Nobody tells you about this hymn. Paul is not just defending Jesus' importance, he is dismantling an entire spiritual economy. If all the fullness of God already lives in Christ, then you do not need a hierarchy of angels to climb. You do not need a secret tier of spiritual achievement to unlock. There is no higher level above Jesus to graduate into. This is where the warning sharpens as Paul tells them to see to it that no one takes them captive. He warns against hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the stoicheia of this world, rather than on Christ. That specific word stoicheia can refer to basic forces or elemental spirits. Basic forces, the foundational rule systems people believed governed the universe, calendars, festivals, cosmic gatekeepers you had to satisfy in the proper order. Think of it as cosmic red tape. A bureaucracy of the unseen. They imagined a bureaucracy of the unseen, where every form had to be filed correctly before moving forward. Paul's accusation is blunt. The believers were being recruited back under rules that Jesus already dethroned. It was a choice between rigid cosmic bureaucracy and cosmic fullness, which was already complete, and living inside a Jesus who rose from the dead. You can easily feel the massive stakes rising here, can't you? This is not merely academic. Paul writes that believers should let no one judge them over food, drink, festivals, or Sabbaths. He calls these legalistic things a mere shadow of what was coming, while the reality is in Christ. True spiritual reality is found entirely in a person, not in a calendar or a diet. Paul adds one more thing as a final blow to anyone tempted to chase angelic visions for status, telling them not to let anyone disqualify them. He criticizes those who insist on false humility and the worship of angels, going into great detail about what they have supposedly seen in visions. He notes that these people are simply puffed up by their unspiritual minds. Notice the irony Paul is pointing at. The very people claiming the deepest spiritual experiences, visions, angelic encounters, secret revelations, are described by Paul not as advanced, but as disconnected from the head. Because everything, Paul insists, must stay joined to Christ, the actual head of the body, from whom the whole body grows. This is not a minor theological footnote sitting quietly in the back of a Bible most people skip past. This is Paul in chains, staking the entire Christian faith on one single claim. Jesus is not just one piece of a complex spiritual puzzle. Jesus is the whole picture, the ultimate source, the glue, and the final goal. And somewhere out on that dusty road, the man carrying this very letter against his chest is getting closer to Colossae with every step. You still do not know his name, but you are about to. His name is Onesimus. Now you know it. Now everything changes. Think back to that road. The heat rising off the stones, the mountains turning purple at dusk, Tychicus walking beside him, carrying the official letter meant for the whole congregation. Beside Tychicus walks this quieter man, the one you have been wondering about since the beginning. He is walking straight toward the exact household he once fled in the night. He was an enslaved man living in Colossae. He was owned by a wealthy believer named Philemon, whose house likely hosted the local church. At some point, Onesimus ran away. Perhaps he stole something on his way out, or maybe he simply walked off into the dark night. Under harsh Roman law, a runaway slave who was caught could face branding, severe beating, or even execution at his master's absolute discretion. You can imagine the terrifying calculation he had to make before leaving. 1,000 miles between Colossae and Rome felt like enough distance to disappear completely. Rome swallowed people whole with its massive markets, crowded alleyways, docks, and neighborhoods where nobody asked for papers. For a runaway with no protection and no money, Rome looked like the safest place in the empire to vanish. Yet somehow in that enormous and anonymous city, Onesimus crossed paths with a chained prisoner named Paul. You can only imagine how that meeting started. A runaway hiding in plain sight finds himself face to face with the very apostle his former master back in Colossae already followed. It was an unexpected turn of events. Maybe Onesimus knew exactly who Paul was, or maybe it was an unplanned accident. Either way, in that cramped prison room, Onesimus hears the life-changing gospel and believes it. Paul writes about him with deep tenderness. "I am sending him back to you," Paul writes in his companion letter to Philemon, no longer as a mere slave, but as something far better, a dear brother. Here is the incredible part of the story that should stop you cold. Paul does not simply let Onesimus disappear safely into the massive city. He sends him all the way back to Colossae, back to the household he fled, and back to the strict legal authority of the master he had previously wronged. Onesimus carry with him on that 900-mile road home this letter, the one you have been listening to this entire time, the one declaring that in Christ there is no longer slave or free, but Christ is all and in all. The cosmic hymn about Jesus holding every throne together is now folded up and pressed against the chest of an enslaved man. He is walking back toward a master who possesses every legal right under Roman law to destroy him. Stay with that image for a moment. The grandest theological claim in the New Testament is being delivered inside a vulnerable, costly act of obedience. Paul refuses to separate cosmic doctrine from real personal mercy doctrine from personal mercy. He hand-delivers them together, in the same scroll, carried by the same trembling hands. Try to picture the other side of that door. For a moment, the moment Philemon actually hears that knock. Philemon had every legal right under Roman law to do whatever he wished with the man standing before him. Anger was understandable and punishment was fully expected. Nobody in that society would have blinked at harsh treatment. Into that exact tense decision, this letter arrives to be read aloud in front of the house church congregation. Its opening chapter declares that every single power in the universe was created by Christ and for Christ. The letter closes by stating that the man standing at the door should be warmly received as a brother. The grand cosmic claim and the intense personal cost are not separate. They are woven together into the exact same message. This text asks a piercing question. Does Jesus actually change anything in our relationships, or is it all just theory? This is exactly where Paul's phrase about chapter 2 lands, with its full, undeniable spiritual weight. He writes that God erased the chirographan, which is the handwritten record of debt. This was the legal certificate listing every charge against you, and Paul boldly declares that God has nailed it directly to the cross. In the first century, it was the actual paper trail of what you owed. Every debt, every broken contract, every legal claim someone could hold against you, written in your own hand, undeniable, unpayable. Merchants kept them. Moneylenders kept these certificates. A man could be hauled before a magistrate with nothing more than his own signature staring back from the page. There was no arguing with it, because he had written the document himself. Onesimus understood that concept better than anyone else in that house church. He had a literal debt, a record of wrongdoing, and a master with a legal claim. Yet Paul tells the congregation that Jesus canceled it all. Jesus nailed that record of debt to the cross and canceled it completely. It was not merely torn up and hidden away in a drawer where it might resurface later. It was nailed directly to a public Roman execution post. The Romans displayed charges against a condemned man for everyone passing by to read. Therefore, this is not a story about keeping festivals or appeasing spirits. It is about whether your heavy debt has been fully paid. This is a profound story about whether the legal debt held against you has finally and completely been paid. You may not be physically enslaved the way Onesimus was, but you know what it feels like to carry a record. You likely carry a long mental list of everything you have failed at. You struggle to feel like you have enough discipline, enough faith, or enough deep spiritual experience to finally feel completely secure in God. You expend endless effort, trying to outrun the quiet suspicion that you are still missing something. Maybe for you it looks like a different kind of ladder, such as another course completed or another habit tracker filled. You might stack books on your nightstand that promise to help you get it together. You go to bed certain that tomorrow's better routine will finally close the gap. But when tomorrow arrives, the gap is still right there. Wholeness always seems to be one step further down the road than where you currently stand. Paul looks straight at people carrying exactly this kind of deep exhaustion and writes the most freeing sentence in the letter. He declares that in Christ, all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form, and you have been brought to fullness in him. You are not merely on your way to fullness or slowly approaching it through personal effort. You are already brought to fullness. The pleroma that false teachers scattered across a complex hierarchy of angels and rituals already lives in Christ completely. You are joined to that completeness right now. You are complete the moment you belong to him. Onesimus carried this liberating sentence on his chest as he walked toward a master who could have killed him. Whatever happened when he knocked on that door, history changed. The early church remembers him well. Some ancient traditions even suggest a bishop named Onesimus later served the church in Ephesus. While history grows quiet on the details, this powerful letter remains loud and clear. 2,000 years later, it still declares that the record against you has been nailed to a cross and canceled in full. This small letter was sent to an almost forgotten city that most people have never even heard of. Colossae may not have survived the massive earthquake that flattened the valley shortly after these words were read. Yet the text leaves us with key takeaways. First, Jesus is not a small piece of a spiritual system. He is not ranked beneath angels or alongside cosmic forces. He is the one through whom everything was made, the one all things were made for, and the one currently holding the entire universe together. As you listen, he sustains reality in a way no earthquake and no empire can ever undo. Takeaway 2, you do not need an extra tier of spiritual achievement to be acceptable to God. You need no secret vision or additional ritual. There is no hidden hierarchy that you have failed to climb. If the entire fullness of God already lives in Christ and you are joined to Him, there is nothing left to reach for. The ladder you imagine is gone. That imaginary ladder was taken down long ago. Takeaway 3 should sit with you the longest. Whatever record you carry against yourself, including every failure and debt, has been completely wiped away by Christ. Your record of shortcomings was not minimized or negotiated down. It was nailed to a cross and canceled, just like the way a master received a runaway slave back as a brother because someone else paid the ultimate cost. He paid what could never be repaid. Which part of this hit you the hardest? Was it the cosmic claim about Jesus holding all things together, or the story of Onesimus walking home with that message folded against his chest? Tell me below which takeaway you needed to hear today, because someone reading the comments after you might need to hear it too. In the end, this letter was never really about compliance with rules or hidden angels. It was never about secret knowledge, a hierarchy of spirits, or a calendar of festivals. It was not about a tier of spiritual achievement waiting above the people. If you strip all of those legalistic additions away, what remains? What remains is a vital question every single person must answer for themselves. Is Jesus the whole picture, or only a piece of it? This letter showed a house church that the Jesus they already had was completely sufficient and always enough.